The summer sun hung low over the rugged hills of the Arizona Territory in 1884, casting long golden shadows across the dusty trail. Rancher Samuel Reed rode slowly toward his isolated ranch, his horse carrying the day's supplies while a warm wind moved through the dry grass. Samuel had spent most of his life on the frontier and had learned to recognize the difference between ordinary sounds and sounds that demanded attention. As he approached the river, he suddenly heard something unusual, a faint, broken cry coming from somewhere beyond the cottonwood trees. He pulled the reins and listened carefully. The crying continued. Without hesitation, Samuel turned his horse toward the river, wondering who could be alone in such a remote place. He dismounted near the riverbank and tied his horse to a low branch. Moving quietly through the trees, Samuel followed the sound until he reached a small clearing beside the water. There, sitting on the dusty ground, was a young Apache girl. She appeared exhausted, frightened, and completely alone. Her dark hair was tangled from traveling through the wilderness, and her traditional clothing was covered with dust. A small tear had formed near her sleeve, revealing a shallow wound on her arm. She immediately noticed Samuel and froze. Her eyes widened with fear as she watched the stranger standing several steps away. Samuel understood that one sudden movement could frighten her even more, so he slowly raised his empty hands to show that he meant no harm. Samuel carefully removed his canteen from his saddle and placed it on a flat stone between them. He also took out a small piece of bread and dried meat that he had saved for his evening meal. Instead of walking closer, he stepped backward and waited. The girl stared at the food, but did not move. Samuel remained silent, giving her time to decide for herself. After several long moments, she slowly crawled forward and reached for the canteen. She drank desperately, then lowered it and looked at him with uncertainty. Samuel could see that she had been traveling for days. There was something deeply heartbreaking about seeing someone so young forced to survive alone in such a harsh land. "My name is Elara," she finally whispered, her voice weak from exhaustion. Samuel did not press her with questions. He simply nodded and told her his name. Elara explained that she had been separated from her family during a dangerous conflict and had been traveling alone ever since. She did not know exactly where her family had gone. She only knew that her younger brother had been with them when they were forced to flee. Samuel listened carefully, realizing that Elara's greatest fear was not for herself. She was afraid that her brother might still be somewhere in the wilderness, waiting for someone to find him. Samuel promised nothing yet, but he knew he could not simply ride away and leave her there. He moved closer, only after Elara seemed comfortable and gently examined the wound on her arm. It was not deep, but it had become dirty from the journey. Samuel tore a clean strip from an old cloth and offered it to her. Elara wrapped it around her arm herself while Samuel watched respectfully. For a moment, the river was peaceful again. Birds moved between the branches and sunlight shimmered across the water. Samuel thought the danger had passed. He began wondering how he could safely take Elara to his ranch, where she could have food, water, and a place to rest. But just as he stood and reached for his horse's reins, Elara suddenly stopped moving. Her face changed completely. The sadness in her eyes disappeared, replaced by pure fear. She slowly turned her head toward the trees on the opposite side of the river. Samuel followed her gaze but saw nothing at first. Then he heard it. A faint, rhythmic sound carried by the wind. Hoofbeats, more than one horse. Samuel immediately understood why Elara was frightened. He looked at her and saw her shaking as she whispered that the riders might be the men she had been running from. Samuel quickly motioned for her to stay low. He moved toward the edge of the trees and listened carefully. The hoofbeats grew louder with every passing second. Samuel's hand moved instinctively toward the rifle secured beside his saddle, but he did not draw it. He had no desire to create a confrontation without knowing who was approaching. Instead, he quickly guided Elara behind a thick cottonwood tree where she would be hidden from the trail. She crouched silently, trying to control her breathing. Samuel stood several yards away, appearing calm despite the growing tension. Moments later, 3 armed riders appeared through the dust along the riverbank. Their horses slowed as they approached the clearing. One of the men raised his hand and called out to Samuel, asking whether he had seen an Apache girl traveling alone. Samuel looked toward the hidden Elara, then back at the riders. He knew that whatever answer he gave next could change both their lives forever. Samuel kept his voice steady as the 3 riders approached the riverbank. The man in front stopped his horse and looked Samuel over carefully. He asked whether Samuel had seen an Apache girl traveling alone through the area. Samuel glanced briefly toward the cottonwood trees, then looked back at the riders and calmly shook his head. He explained that he had been riding along the river for some time, but had seen nobody. The riders did not seem convinced. One of them dismounted and began searching the nearby ground, examining footprints in the dust. Samuel remained beside his horse, hiding his concern. Behind the tree, Elara pressed herself against the rough bark, barely breathing as the stranger searched only a few yards away. The rider eventually returned to his horse, but before leaving, he warned Samuel not to interfere if he found the girl. Samuel simply nodded and watched the 3 men disappear into the distance. He waited several minutes before approaching the cottonwood tree. Elara slowly stepped from behind it, her face still pale with fear. Samuel told her they had to leave immediately because the riders might return. He helped her onto his horse and walked beside them, choosing a narrow trail through the hills rather than the main road. By sunset, they reached his small ranch, where Samuel gave Elara clean water, food, and a warm blanket. For the first time in days, she was able to sleep without listening for approaching horses. The next morning, Samuel discovered that Elara had already been awake before sunrise. She stood near the corral, staring toward the distant mountains. Samuel understood that she was thinking about her family. When he asked what she planned to do, Elara explained that her younger brother Thomas had disappeared during their escape. She believed he might still be alive somewhere near an old trading trail. Samuel knew the area was dangerous, but he also knew what it meant to lose family on the frontier. After preparing supplies, horses, water, and a small medical kit, he agreed to help her search. Elara looked at him with gratitude, knowing that a stranger had chosen to risk his own safety for someone he barely knew. For several days, Samuel and Elara traveled through the harsh Arizona landscape. They followed old tracks across dry valleys, crossed shallow streams, and searched abandoned camps for any sign of Thomas. Their journey was difficult, but slowly they began to trust each other. Elara knew the land in ways Samuel did not, recognizing distant mountains and old trails hidden beneath the desert brush. Samuel knew how to read horse tracks and find safe places to rest. Together, their different skills became their greatest advantage. One afternoon, Elara discovered a small piece of blue cloth caught on a thorn bush. She immediately recognized it as part of her brother's shirt. Hope returned to her eyes, and Samuel knew they were finally getting close. The trail led them toward an abandoned mining settlement nestled between rocky hills. As they approached, they heard a faint sound coming from an old wooden shed. Samuel carefully entered and found a frightened young boy hiding inside. It was Thomas. He was weak and hungry but alive. Elara rushed toward him and held her brother tightly, tears filling her eyes. Samuel stepped outside and gave them a moment together. After years of surviving alone, he realized that the greatest reward was not money, land, or reputation. It was knowing that he had helped reunite a family that might otherwise have been lost forever. When Samuel, Elara, and Thomas finally returned to the ranch, the 3 of them watched the sunset from the porch. Elara thanked Samuel for saving her life and helping her find her brother. Samuel told her that he had simply done what he believed was right. In the months that followed, Elara and Thomas chose to remain near the ranch while they rebuilt their lives. Samuel continued working the land, But something inside him had changed. The lonely rancher, who once believed he needed nothing beyond his horse and his land, had discovered the value of compassion, trust, and family. He had found Elara crying beside a river, but in helping her, Samuel had found a new purpose for his own life. Sometimes, the moment that changes a person's life begins with nothing more than stopping to help someone who is hurting.